Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarlane. This one is episode 225, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/225. On the line, I have Joseph Solis-Mullen. Welcome to the show, Joseph.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to have you on. You just had a great article come out at the Libertarian Institute, and I understand this is kind of a working paper for you. But I wanted to discuss that. It's called The Fake China Threat and Its Very Real Danger. And so this is your first time on the Liberty Weekly podcast. Do you just want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, Patrick. I'd be happy to. I'm a political scientist and a current graduate student at the University of Missouri in the economics department there. I write at the Mises Institute primarily. I also contribute pieces at places like the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, financial websites as well. I do a lot of macro analysis, things like that. And I focus a lot on just kind of trying to explain things that people see in the news without the Washington spin to it.
Yeah, and you had an excellent piece again at the Mises Institute, and you were interviewed by Scott Horton, I think, in 2021, and that was kind of tackling the same issues. But we were talking a little bit before we started recording, and you were saying how you initially got turned on to the whole China threat specter.
Yes. I have the unfortunate habit of reading the paper every day and reading most mainstream periodicals, things like The Economist, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, Harper's, Financial Times, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and it started to just be every single day. China. They arrested a student who was supposedly spying. They've got intel that they're stealing more intellectual property. They just floated an aircraft carrier, and it was just every single day something else. And it was just creating this atmosphere. And this was back in 2019 when I started really, because it really did. It kind of came, I wouldn't say out of nowhere, but it really started getting the volume turned up. And then in the wake of the coronavirus and stuff, it just really, I think that was a convenient time to just turn it full blast. So I started researching because I had been studying China's economy and had come to the conclusion, like many very sober people, that it's a giant credit bubble that's going to have to pop at some point, that they're totally export and import dependent. They're the number one globalization dependent country on earth. And without a very finely tuned set of circumstances that they really can't control, their entire economy will collapse. And so I started expanding that to look at things like its geography, its history, its demographics, its neighbors, its military capabilities, and its history of relations with the United States. And that brought us to this working paper, which will be presented at the Libertarian Scholars Conference. And so I had reached out to the fine editors at the Libertarian Institute to see whether or not they would be interested in running a preprint so that I could get some early feedback. And so now we're here.
Yeah, and I think that I was telling you before we went on, I love the paper because it hits up all these different things, and in a way it kind of encapsulates the problem of someone taking a look at China to begin with, because there's so much there, and there's so much that's completely foreign to people in the United States. And frankly, that's something I'm grappling with right now in my studies of China, because, I mean, there's a 4,000-year civilization history that exists there. There's things that the United States, I mean, we don't learn in school really the beginning of Chinese history and culture, anything about that. And so if I was thinking of one major global player that Americans know little to nothing about, it would be China. Would you agree?
Yes, which is really shocking because it is, of course, as you said, the longest continuously running civilizational, I wouldn't call it state, but it is a recognizable civilizational structure that has existed in a similar geography since before the Roman Empire and ever since in various iterations.
Yeah.
So it's the absolute most important country that Americans should know something about. So,
yeah. And I think, like I said, I think you do a good job of hitting up all these finer points because there's a lot of them. And it's like the struggles, like I said, especially in my own coverage, of where do you start and how deep do you go? Because you could go really deep down the rabbit hole, diving after all these issues. But I think for someone who wants to learn about U.S.-China relations, it's probably best to start with history and to realize, or at least try to understand, what some of the Chinese goals are. And from reading your paper and doing some of the background reading, it really seems to me, especially with the Taiwan issue, that China's really in search of being free from the yoke of Western powers, colonizers or just Western powers interfering with their sphere of influence. And the second thing being, it's a nation that has really struggled to modernize over the last 200 years. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think that's very fair to say. And I think that when you start looking at the history, while there is, as you said, a lot of it to look at, for the average American, I think the real place to start looking at it is in the mid-19th century, because China was not unaccustomed to foreign invasions. They had been invaded and taken over by a variety of different peoples and dynasties. The thing is that the Confucian bureaucratic state was so powerful and its culture was so powerful that they were able to Sinify all of its conquerors. The Western powers were different. They sought to put their own culture, their own ways. Christianity, when the Opium Wars were concluded, the first Opium War, which was concluded in the early 1840s, one of the things that the British demanded was access for Christian missionaries in China. That was a big deal. And Christianity in China remains a big deal today. But so for the average American, I would say start with the mid-19th century, when the Western powers, which by that point had started to rapidly industrialize and to take a lot of inventions that really they didn't invent themselves. You know, the Europeans didn't invent gunpowder or complex mathematics. They imported all of that stuff. However, especially during the early modern period, what you had in Europe was a highly competitive state system where your ability to marshal effective military resources was the difference between life and death. And so there was an adaptive advantage to being able to organize and to conquer. And so you developed this very militarized, very complex series of societies. And there are several great books on it. It's not exactly, out of the blue that I'm saying this. This is a very well-established body of literature. But basically, they were able to industrialize faster, to organize their societies in a way that was more efficient. For example, the Bank of England. The Bank of England is one of the most incredible power projection inventions ever. It allowed them to basically just outlast their much larger, much more populous competitors by being able to finance industrial military capabilities. We don't really think about that, but it was very expensive to wage these kinds of wars. And one of the things that encouraged the powers to go east over water was the fall of Constantinople, of course. The arrival of the Ottoman Empire, that removed their access to overland routes, which were already very expensive. So that spurred the deep water navigation period. And so eventually, as they're getting more powerful, the European states, relatively more powerful that is, at the same time, the Qing dynasty is nearing collapse. And basically a series of wars between the British, mostly the British, but also the French, in order to get access to the Chinese market is what they wanted. And these were the Opium Wars. And one of the things I point out in my paper is that the Americans were actually part of that. They actually had troops fighting in the Second Opium War, which is astonishing because we're talking about the 1850s here. You had U.S. boots in China in the 1850s. And while there was, there's always been this schizophrenic side to American foreign policy, this tension between commercial expansion and idealism. And so while there was a lot of protest about what the European powers were doing, there was also a very strong push not to let us get left out. So we wanted all the same access that the Europeans were getting. And this was the open door policy, which actually FDR's grandfather was one of the ones who pushed that. So just to show you how this all kind of ties together, and it is relatively recent stuff. So that's where I would suggest doing your research. If you're an American, you're listening to this, and you want to understand where China's issues with the United States come from, I would start right there. I would start with the First and Second Opium Wars. And actually, the U.S. also sent troops to help put down the Boxer Rebellion, which was being encouraged by the Qing dynasty, the Qing imperial system, because it was basically a revolution to try and fight back against the imperial powers. So,
and one thing I've been trying to do is every weekend I get 2.5 hours to mow the lawn because I have a big lawn. And so when I do that, I try to put on, something new. And I was listening to this podcast called Sino Babble. And I'm sure if you just type in, China podcast, China history podcast in your podcatcher, you'll come up with tons of results. But this one I was listening to starts exactly where you start, because it does seem like that's the place that you should start to learn about U.S.-China relations. And the other thing that I kind of keyed in on is this transition that China has between these from the imperial system to the Chinese Republic, and then to the Chinese Communist Party. And this happens in a very brief span of time, relatively speaking.
Certainly in terms of Chinese history, it's the blink of an eye when we're talking about a civilization that's thousands of years old. Certainly. There were two, there was a right and left who were both wanting to be free of the imperial system. Now, the Kuomintang, we're just going to call them the right, and then the CCP, we're just going to call them the left, just keep things simple. But they organizationally were not very profound. These were, student and peasant movements. The real power players, starting in 1912 and even a little bit before that, toward when everything was starting to fall apart, were basically a bunch of warlords who were fighting over turf. Now, this was something that you had happened several times in Chinese history, warlord periods, warring states periods. And one of the things that was very, very damaging to the United States' image at this time was you had the Chinese Exclusion Act that had been passed. You had a lot of anti-Chinese violence that happened in the United States around the turn of the century as well. This all filtered back to China. There was a huge movement to boycott American goods. Well, Wilson wanted the Chinese Republican government to jump into World War I. And he convinced them to do so. And this is not very well known, but they actually sent hundreds of thousands of laborers to work building field hospitals, manning French factories, supplying real manpower. Thousands of Chinese died on the Western Front in World War I, fighting on the side of the Allies, assisting the Allied war effort. And in exchange for that, they were supposed to get back the imperial possessions that Germany had taken from them. They were also supposed to receive relief from the unequal treaties that had been imposed following the first two Opium Wars. They were supposed to get back the right to collect their own revenue. When the war ended, however, Wilson decided that rather than do that, he was going to give that territory to the Japanese, who had opportunistically occupied that territory when hostilities commenced in Europe. Japan, of course, was on the side of the Allied powers, even though it didn't really do any fighting. This was mostly just an opportunistic land grab for them. But this was just a horrifying moment in American-China relations, because you had people from Sun Yat-sen to Mao Zedong both saying Woodrow Wilson is the greatest guy that's ever lived, and America is going to free us and stuff, and they're just the best. And then we basically turn around and show ourselves to be just as exploitative as any of the other imperial powers. And it was incredibly damaging. It was incredibly damaging, as was Warren G. Harding's decision to recognize a series of warlords who just happened to seize the capital, because they were basically the Soviets at that time, who had seized power themselves. They were trying to basically force a coalition government together between the right and the left, and they were financing them, sending advisors and stuff. The United States during the 1920s didn't want anything to do with that. They were just recognizing the warlords. So again, this really boosted communism from nothing. There was no communist presence in China prior to the Treaty of Versailles, really. And after that, right as the Western powers were doing this stuff, in particular the United States, Lenin and the Bolsheviks renounced all their extraterritorial rights in China that they had inherited from the Russian Empire, started giving them arms and support. So, I mean, it was a total disaster. So as far as the rise of the CCP goes, Sun Yat-sen is succeeded by Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek hates communism, decides he's going to turn on the communists and try and destroy them. He is successful in driving them basically into hiding the Long March. People, I think, are generally aware of that, even in the United States. So communism is basically forced underground. However, right around the same time, the Japanese decide we're going to start taking huge bites out of China, which they do. They start invading China all over the place. The United States decides we would rather just let the Chinese and Japanese bleed each other out. Chiang Kai-shek would love some help, but again, it's just warned. I think it was Herbert Hoover who said we should be aware, or however much we might not like it, we should recognize that the Japanese in Manchuria does not negatively affect American interests. That was basically his explanation of it. And of course, World War II comes along. Japanese, again, the United States doesn't really funnel very much support to Chiang Kai-shek's government. They're more focused on the Western Front. And again, they see it as just easier to deal with a much weakened China, and Japan and China are just bleeding one another out. War ends, and George Marshall is sent to China. And George Marshall basically arrives at the conclusion that the Soviets had arrived at 20 years ago, which was we need to have a coalition government, a unity government. The communists and the Kuomintang, they need to come together. Chiang Kai-shek doesn't want to do this. He feels like he and his men and his people, they sacrificed enough, and so it was their country, and they should be getting more American support. The Americans start finally giving them support, but they were reluctant to do so. It wasn't very popular. Back in the good old days, the American people actually used to object to us flushing money into these, black holes of foreign conflicts. So they weren't sure they were going to be able to get the money to do it, especially when they were trying to give money to the Europeans at the time. At the same time, however, the CCP was getting boatloads of arms and training and money from the Soviet Union. They sweep south. Kuomintang are pushed out. It's important to understand, too, that the Kuomintang were not efficient governors. Hyperinflation was out of control. Goods shortages were everywhere. The people of China were suffering tremendously. Of course, it's not entirely their fault. They were embroiled in a terrible war with the Japanese occupiers. Although it is important to note, too, rather than joining up with the CCP, the Kuomintang actually were giving weapons back to Japanese soldiers who were still in China to have them help fight the communists, their fellow Chinese, who had basically been spending their time trying to build their credibility among the peasantry, who basically looked to the capital and saw that, oh, wait, they're in bed with the Japanese. Aren't they the enemy? And of course, those animosities go back quite a long ways. And of course, even today, there's still quite strong feeling. You're talking about people's grandparents who were alive during like the rape of Nanking and stuff. I mean, it's just horrible things. So, and that basically set up the dynamic that you have today, where Russia and the Soviet Union was backing the CCP, and the United States was backing the Republican government, which fled to Formosa, Taiwan, and that's been it. That's been it. Mao attempted to retake the islands, but the United States prevented this from happening. Starting with Truman, and then Eisenhower carried it through, and that was basically the policy all the way through. If the mainland started to look a little bit bellicose, sail the aircraft carrier battle groups right through. And so this Civil War would have been over. It would have been over 1955, probably at the latest. But instead, granted, Taiwan has tremendous strategic value. As MacArthur said, it's a floating aircraft carrier right off the coast of China. So it's understandable why U.S. security planners and military people don't want to give it up and are reluctant to follow through on the 3 communiques that Nixon and Kissinger negotiated and which formed the basis of eventual normalization of relations between Beijing and Washington under Jimmy Carter. So I don't know where you want to go with that. I know I threw a lot at you there, but... No,
I think that's great. And I wanted to mention before I forgot, too, that didn't it come out just recently that Eisenhower had been presented a plan by the Joint Chiefs of Staff to escalate to nuclear war over the Taiwan issue? I think in the first and second Taiwan crises.
Yes, that is true.
Yeah, that's pretty alarming. I don't think I mentioned to the audience, I released a piece the day after your piece came out at the Institute. Well, it went out this morning. It's called Taiwan and Our Feigned Ambiguity. And basically, I try to make the case that there's this idea of strategic ambiguity, that the U.S. policy, again, once we left off kind of in 1979, where there's kind of a rapprochement between China and the United States, where the United States kind of flips on its Taiwan policy, says that Taiwan is part of China. This is the one China policy. And since then, we've had another Taiwan crisis in 1995, but the U.S. official position is that Taiwan is part of China. And I talk about that quite a bit as well. And so that's kind of finishing up, where we left off in 1979. But it always seems like, since then the United States is just kind of acting like it's not, like it's adhering to strategic ambiguity, while at the same time acting like they no longer are following that policy, is, I guess, generally my thesis.
I think there's a lot to that, and it is a complicated issue. So I guess what I would say about that is, personally, I think strategic ambiguity is somewhat misnamed, simply because a strategy is an overall concept for control. A tactic is how you accomplish that strategy. The U.S. strategy, it seems clear to me, has always been, we don't want Taiwan under Beijing's control. And the tactic for accomplishing that, in order to get Beijing to go along with balancing against the Soviets, was to use the tactic of strategic ambiguity. And once that no longer became useful, once the Soviet Union ceased to exist, there was a very clear shift away from that policy. It's not often remarked, but the Taiwan Straits crises of the 1990s that occurred near the first Taiwanese election were in no small part a response to the fact that the United States granted a visa to one of the candidates to come speak at Cornell, which was seen as a gross violation of the three communiques. Which, again, they were deliberately worded ambiguously. But, again, just like with the whole not 1 inch promise, yes, it's true. There was a legalistic addendum added to the 2+4 agreement that said troops could come into the eastern part of Germany if Berlin said so. That's true. But the spirit of the agreement was very clearly that the alliance wasn't going to expand east, right? Just like the spirit of the three communiques was that Taiwan would eventually be reunified with the mainland, and that we would not have diplomatic contact with them, that we would not have a security agreement with them, that we would not base troops on Taiwan. But what are we doing? We got troops on Taiwan. We got high-level U.S. officials going there. I mean, Nancy Pelosi is going to go visit, even though even the Pentagon says this is a terrible idea. I thought your piece, you had sent that to me. That was a great piece. And it really is just the most dangerous and irresponsible thing in the world, the way that we're, I mean, I always just ask people, try and have some strategic empathy. Try and view this situation from Beijing's perspective. I mean, this just has to be the most provocative and backstabbing looking thing imaginable. And they're just supposed to take it. And part of me thinks that this is a deliberate strategy. Robert Kagan, everyone's favorite guy who's wrong about everything. He had a piece in Foreign Policy, or Foreign Affairs, actually, I think it was, earlier this year, where he was basically arguing that, really, we should just push China into doing something now, because they'll be even stronger in the future. And you look at the way that we behave, I mean, of course, it's always cast as, well, look, China's being aggressive. Well, look, Russia's being aggressive. Well, why are they being aggressive? Of course, most people want to pretend that history started this morning, but it didn't. And I really think that that's one of the things that really inhibits a healthy dialogue in the United States is because there's just a rush to see who can look stronger. It's not about who's right. It's not about what's fair, what we agreed to. It's about the fact that politicians on both sides of the aisle know that they will get just crushed mercilessly by the other side if they don't seem like the toughest person who woke up this morning about whoever we're going to fight today. Whether it's Iran, which why on earth are we doing it? Why didn't Joe Biden, the instant he got into office, just say Donald Trump was an idiot and we're going back in the agreement? No. Instead, he was afraid of the political consequences of doing that. And so now here we are, and we're probably going to wind up going to war with Iran at some point. I don't know that the U.S. boots will directly be involved, but I'm so certain at some point it's going to happen now. But that's basically the same situation with China. Our quote unquote diplomacy is just so hyper militarized. I mean, we have no ability to conduct normal foreign relations with anyone else because real diplomacy requires compromise. And again, I think the way we teach American history really makes it difficult for us to have effective foreign policy today. Because if you remember learning about the Cuban Missile Crisis, or you watch like a little special on the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, was resolved because Kennedy was so strong and he stood up to Khrushchev. And that's the lesson. You never back down. Wrong, right? That's not what happened. He sent Bobby to go tell the Russian ambassador to tell Khrushchev, hey, listen, I can't say this out loud because I'll get crushed during the midterms. But if you get those missiles out of there, we'll pull our missiles out of Turkey. That's how that happened, right? But in the popular imagination, Reagan won the Cold War because he just showed the Soviets that he was the toughest guy ever and they were never going to bend his back. It's like, no, that's not what happened at all. So it really makes it tough. Because you read about it, it's like we need to draw the lessons from how we won the first Cold War. It's like, one, we didn't win. It got called off because it was crazy. And we were lucky that the whole world didn't get blown up. And now you've got people who have, supposedly learned the lessons of history who are just as blind as can be. They have a lot of incentives to do so. I always look at the incentive structures that people face. And when you look at the think tanks and if someone offers you $20,000 to write a paper about the threat from this country, and you come back and say, well, there isn't a threat from that country. Well, they're just going to go find someone else to write that paper. There's no shortage of people who will write that paper. So it's not about, being correct. It's about threat inflation. It's about getting paid. It's about keeping the arms industry getting paid. Just look at the war in Yemen. I mean, Raytheon literally went to Donald Trump and was like, you've got to veto the War Powers Act. You promised us that you were going to get us paid. And that was it. It's just plain as day. But instead, we have to turn on the TV and hear, some triviality about something that doesn't even matter. He fist bumped him. Did he fist bump him? What did the fist bump mean? Was it wise to fist bump him? And it's like, that's what's important.
Right.
That's what's important.
Yeah.
Just trivialities. It blows me away.
Well, I was just thinking of the craziness of Nancy Pelosi possibly kicking off World War III, or at least another Taiwan Strait crisis. I mean, you can't make this up. It's just so absurd.
Yeah. And Joe Biden just repeatedly saying, I think three times now, I think it is. And I think you pointed out in your article, 3 times he said, we do have a commitment to defend Taiwan. And then, the spin team runs out and they're like, oh, no. What he meant was we aren't going to do that because we haven't changed anything. Same policy. Maybe one time you can get away with saying, you know what? He's 100 years old. He just had a slip of the tongue. But really, I think what's going on here is that they're just building up you have to build the thought environment to normalize this very crazy idea. And actually, Mark Esper was just giving, the old defense secretary under Trump, he was just giving a talk the other day where he talked about, we need to really start preparing the American people for the idea that Taiwan is an independent country and we stand with Taiwan and they're not part of China and stuff. And as much as I want to give the American people credit for being very smart, because on an individual level, people are very smart. But when you get them together, people are dumb. On an individual level, people are very smart. Put them in a huge crowd, give them a bunch of, iPhones. Very dumb. Very dumb. Easily manipulated.
Yep.
And in the World War III, the end of humanity might come because Nancy Pelosi wants to go to Taiwan. This is our third highest ranking member of our government going to visit Taiwan. But of course, you say the three communiques, and 99% of Americans have no idea what you're even talking about. They think Taiwan is a country.
Right. Yeah.
Even though it's not U.S. government policy, it's not recognized by the UN, nothing. And, you go to speak out about it. And this is why I have such respect for guys like you, guys like Kyle, Scott, Dave, who go out there and just tell the truth, because you get crushed for it. I know I get crushed all the time for it. And, you're definitely closing career doors in your face just for telling the truth.
Yeah.
It's the truth. Like, you're shutting tons of doors in your face just by telling the truth for no money at all. Like, I don't get paid to say this stuff, but
yeah, but
I think it's important.
Right. Somebody needs to say it. I mean, I'm lucky enough to, I have a small town law practice that allows, in a lot of ways it facilitates me being able to work on this in my spare time, or part-time at least now. But, and Scott having the Institute and being able to sponsor, this content with donor dollars. And it really is something special that I'm proud to be a part of. But it is, and it does, like we were talking about before we went on too, that neither of us are China scholars, and I don't think it's important to be a China scholar. I mean, especially when there's no work really coming out from our independent perspective. I mean, on the other side of it, you do have influencers who are Chinese expats, or they have some connection to China, and it's like, yes, in some ways I want to collaborate with them, but I'm also wary of dual loyalties, or because you don't want to go the other way and just be a shill for China either. But to have that, independent perspective is difficult.
Yeah, I think you should read everyone. Read everyone. Do so with an eye towards verifying. That's really it. You don't need to be an expert on China, but you do need to do a lot of research, and you need to independently verify things. And it's hard work. It's easier to just sit there and have someone tell you, no, this is how it is. This is how it is. And people just pick the side that they want to be on, and that's it. But it's really not a black and white issue.
Yeah, it's not.
I mean, I was just thinking of this book that I just picked up, Red Roulette, I think it's called. I haven't actually read it yet, but he's a I don't know what you'd call him, a defector, I guess, because he was a former party guy. But you read a book like that, and yes, I mean, obviously there is a value in reading something like that, but you also have to bear in mind what their agenda might be, because most of these people have an agenda on both sides. And so I just think it's important for people like us to just tell the American people, look, Taiwan is not a country. We said that we weren't going to militarily have anything to do with it. We were just going to supply them arms and stuff. Now Joe Biden is acting like we're going to send the carriers in there. It would be a terrible idea. A bunch of Americans would get killed. It might start World War III. And really, China does not want to upset the apple cart. China is the most globalization dependent state on earth. If anything happens to globalization, China is going to suffer enormously. It would probably lead to the disintegration of the Chinese state. I write about it in the article, and I give you the geographic reasons, the demographic reasons, the economic reasons, the geopolitical reasons, the import-export reasons. I mean, I really try and make the clear case here that, look, we have been messing around. We, the United States, have been messing around in Chinese internal affairs since 1850. Slightly before that, actually. But basically the 1840s, 1850s. They would like us to please stop. And I feel like they've been pretty patient about this. We are being increasingly belligerent. And I go into all the alliance building stuff, all of the attempts to sabotage efforts, like China wanted to have its own Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. Behind the scenes, the Obama administration is going around telling everybody, you better not join that. Don't you join that. You better not join that. It's like, why? Are we afraid they're going to help some poor people? Like, what? There was actually a really telling book that was written about 10, 12 years ago by, Bob Kaplan, where he was reflecting on monsoon relief and how the U.S. Navy, chugged in there and did the job. And then he had this little passage where he said, in the future, other able societies like India and China will help in this relief and diminish the US's share of the glory. And it was like, what? That's your concern here? Like, it costs almost $40 billion a year to run these damn ships. And you're worried that some other countries that are closer in the region might start carrying the water, providing some public goods, because we might not get all the credit. It's really that vain on some levels. So,
hey guys, welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best place to do that is at my membership website, libertyweekly.club. Once you go there, put that in the URL, go up to the top right-hand corner, and you can subscribe to my newsletter, which there's a free version, but premium members will get bonuses, access to preprints of my articles, and access to a premium members-only live stream that I do every third Thursday of the month. This month I had Connor Freeman on, and we talked about Tim Pool. We also talked about my article about Taiwan and the crisis involving Nancy Pelosi. As a part of talking about Tim Pool, we went through and we looked at his live streams that he took from the Maidan Revolution when he was there covering the incident with Vice, who was doing some propaganda shilling for the US-backed coup. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But again, my editorials, you get preprints to those. The one that came out today, which is Tuesday, July 26th, was actually published on July 22nd. So my supporting listeners got to read that much earlier. And like I said, there's also free blog posts for free members of the newsletter, the membership site. So go check that out, libertyweekly.club. Also, I haven't been great at mentioning the guest appearances that I do and everything like that. But again, Keith Knight had the Voluntarist Handbook that he published a couple weeks ago. I have an article on inside the book. It's a collection of essays, but I have an essay that I published in the book about central banking, so you should go check that out. Also, next week I have Prof. CJ joining us of the Dangerous History podcast, Prof. CJ, and he did a really long episode. It's part one of a long series of World War I propaganda, and I think that's especially prescient in these times. It's something I've covered on the show, and I'm really excited to get Prof. CJ's input. We're going to be looking at World War I propaganda and comparing it to the current situation with Ukraine. So again, the one-stop shop I'd send everyone is my membership website, libertyweekly.club. That's pretty much everything I got right now. Thanks everyone for listening to the show. Thank you for your support. Thanks to all my premium members over there at libertyweekly.club. And I hope that you would join them and help support my content. Thanks. Well, and what I thought was interesting too is that I think I was talking to Scott at Freedom Fest about this, where it seems like we've never, in some sense, we've never really evolved out of the feudal system, where now all of these nations under the U.S. security umbrella are just, what is that? What do they call that? Vassal nations of the United States. And maybe on some level, behind that, I don't know if it's with the World Bank, or the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and some things like that, that these nations are de facto vassal nations of the United States, and that's what it boils down to. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it is a mutually beneficial arrangement. Globalization. This is what it was. This was the strategy after the Cold War, because the American people were never going to go for something like, occupying all these countries. It wasn't possible. So basically what they landed on was, look, we'll guarantee your security. So you will not have an independent foreign policy. But we will open up the American market for you to dump all your goods into. And you can have access to American capital and make yourselves rich. And let's take a look. South Korea. 60 years ago, when my grandpa was there fighting in the war, it was literally nothing. It was nothing. Now, it's one of the wealthiest, most advanced countries on earth. Japan. The Philippines, which I know it's a complicated situation there because of the colonial history of the United States and stuff. But basically, that was the idea. You take away the independent foreign policy, which will alleviate the incentive for them to fight amongst themselves. This is the idea of the long peace that John Lewis Gaddis writes about, which, keeping peace in Western Europe by basically just taking away their armies and stuff, saying, no, we're in charge of that stuff now. You just focus on getting rich, and you can use the American market and American capital to get yourselves rich. And the integration of China into that system, there's all sorts of different intertwined theories about why that was going to happen to China. There's democratic peace theory, development theory. There's all these different things that imagine that history is some sort of arc. And if you just follow these certain steps, these things will happen. And the idea was, we're going to integrate China into all these systems. We're going to give them most favored nation status. We're going to let them into the WTO. We're going to enmesh them in globalization. We're going to make China rich. And as China becomes rich, its middle classes are going to demand political power. Eventually, the CCP will either liberalize the society politically, or they'll get overthrown. And basically, as China becomes more powerful, that transitional friction that comes when you have a rising power and a declining power, relatively declining, that is, the Thucydides trap, that gets avoided because you have the same values. So I wrote an article, I don't know, a year ago, where I talked about that moment of transitional friction between the British and the Americans, and how that was in many ways eased by the liberal values that they shared. That the British weren't as freaked out by the idea of the Americans becoming sort of masters of their old dominions. And the idea was, well, even if China does become crazy powerful by us making them rich because they have 1 billion people and tons of land and stuff, that it won't matter. There won't be friction because they'll be a prosperous, liberal, democratic, capitalist society just like us. And of course, that isn't what happened at all. And so now, belatedly, the U.S. establishment has decided, oh man, they're actually just getting rich, powerful, and they're still authoritarian. That means they're a threat to us. We need to fight them. So after making China crazy rich and powerful now, which, like, relatively speaking, they are. I know I write about China, like, you know, all the reasons I think it's not very powerful in the paper. But really, realistically, they're powerful enough, especially if we go poking around in their backyard. They're plenty powerful enough to do serious, serious damage to anything we put in their area. You had talked about the missiles. Absolutely. If any of our carriers got anywhere close, I think that was before we came on, we were talking. But yeah, you had mentioned if the carrier strike groups got anywhere close to Taiwan, I mean, it could be the deaths of thousands of sailors, thousands, in the blink of an eye. So I think you just have to be realistic at this point. China is what it is. It is not changing. But I also think that by stepping back and taking a more calm view of things, you realize that actually China is pretty much trapped. It is not going to become a regional hegemon. It certainly is not going to take over the world. And if it's not careful, the society is going to completely collapse on itself for economic, and demographic, and natural resource and environmental reasons. And the worst thing in my mind that you can do from the United States perspective is to be seen as having precipitated this collapse, because that's going to be the saving hand for the CCP. Because instead of the United States just standing around minding its own business, where all the Chinese people go, hey, CCP, you ruined all our lives. You messed up the country and stuff. Instead, the CCP is going to be able to point to the U.S. right offshore and be like, what do you want us to do? We were becoming powerful and rich. And then the United States, they couldn't take it. So they decided to undercut us and destroy us. So, you know, unless you want to be exploited by the European powers again, you better stick with us. I mean, I think it's going to be a perfectly easy story to tell, and it's not half wrong. So
one really interesting thing that you mentioned before, and I can't remember if we were recording or not when this happened, if you'll forgive me. We were talking about the hypersonic missiles versus U.S. aircraft and the range and the speed at which you could just pluck them right out of the sea. The other issue you had countered about that, though, was that that China is so dependent on globalization that if the United States and the global West were to institute the same kind of economic warfare that we're currently waging against Russia, China wouldn't be able to survive it and indeed maybe turn out ahead of it like Russia is.
Not at all. Not at all. Russia was built to withstand these sanctions. When Putin took power, he realized we need to abandon the idea of the Soviet Union, which was we are an advanced manufacturing society. He looked around and read the demographic tea leaves and said, we just don't have the population for this stuff. We don't have enough of an internal consumer market, yada, yada, yada. But we do have tons of natural resources, which don't require a lot of people. They don't require a hyper-skilled population, and we can be plenty rich that way. And that works. It's just fine. But they're built for that. And they also have things that you can't get anywhere else. Things like oil and natural gas, for example, or at least you can't get them quickly because it takes infrastructure. China, on the other hand, imports all its food, all its oil, all its natural gas, and it produces way more manufacturing than its internal market could ever hope to absorb. So it is constantly in danger. And actually, unemployment in China is dangerously high. It's at like 9%. And that's like according to their official statistics, which are, always a little dubious. It's probably a little higher than that. And so they're already feeling the pinch here. They have got to get their products out the door. That's one of the useful things about the Belt and Road Initiative is you can create more credit, give it to a country, and then have them use those credits, the renminbi, to buy your overproduction. And if you can convince them to take some Chinese laborers with them. So that's really what the Belt and Road is about. Yes, there's geopolitical calculations involved, but a lot of it's just domestic politics. It's control, it's the economy. And so, when you look at China, it is not Russia. It needs imports. It needs them bad. And it needs exports. And it needs the export markets of Western Europe and the United States. And so when people say, well, it's only Europe and the United States who are doing this, that's true. But that's exactly who China absolutely 100% must have on board here. So I think it's a question because, yes, the United States was able and the Western European governments were able to get their people to take a lot of financial pain. And so I had written right at the start of the war that I felt like Washington had one eye on China the whole time, basically saying, check it out. Look at these sanctions. Yeah, we got everybody to go along with these that matter. And you better believe it. If you even look at Taiwan, we'll slam your fingers in the window so hard you won't even know what happened. The missiles. Absolutely. If our carriers got anywhere near Taiwan, they would be, it's obviously hard to shoot them in the middle of the ocean. The ocean is big. It's difficult. But there's no doubt that they could do it. And they have plenty of these missiles. But realistically, if you absolutely felt compelled to intervene in the event of a potential invasion or blockade of Taiwan by the mainland, it would be as simple as just deploying the fleet to the Persian Gulf and just cutting off their oil supplies. Because the oil they get from Russia isn't nearly enough to keep that economy running. We're talking about collapse within a month. Total economic collapse. Their industry would completely shut down. Their population would starve. It's really that bad. They have so many people. They have less arable agricultural land per capita than Saudi Arabia. They have less access to clean water per capita than like Libya. It's very, very bad. They absolutely have to have petrochemical fertilizers. They have to have tons of natural gas. They have to have a lot of oil. And much of that stuff comes through Malacca, Hormuz. That's why their security planners are so paranoid about those, Malacca dilemmas, because they recognize that that's the real weakness. They've built up an area denial capacity with their fast attack submarines and their mines and their missile batteries that they could absolutely prevent the United States from coming in and actually physically intervening in Taiwan directly, unless you were willing to put tens of thousands of American soldiers and sailors' lives on the line, which I don't know that the American public would stomach. But again, it's the economic weapon and it's the ability to shut off the oil. So I think you're going to see a huge building spree over the next several years of pipeline going from Russia to China. But then China is putting themselves very much at the mercy of the Russians, and it's not entirely clear whether or not Russian oil production will be able to stay where it's at. You see things in the news about how, they need all these parts coming back from Canada and stuff. So it's a complicated situation. And my preference would be that none of this happens. None of this happens at all. Because it's totally unnecessary. It's not helpful to American interests. Yes, we get a lot of semiconductors, like 90% of advanced semiconductors from Taiwan. But the only reason that we do that is because Apple and other companies like that save a few bucks. That's really it. Look what the U.S. government is now basically subsidizing them building those factories here in the United States. So I'm usually opposed to things like that, but this is one instance where I'm like, well, if it gives us less reason to be involved in Taiwan, then maybe okay. I mean, it's obviously a big boondoggle and handout to companies that are crazy profitable already. But if it reduces our dependence on Taiwan's microchips,
well, I'm
that
glad,
might be worthwhile.
I'm glad you mentioned that too, because Dave DeCamp just had an article talking about those. Is the subsidy? It's called the CHIPS Act, and I think it's been proposed in the House and the Senate. I'm not sure what the status is, but yeah. So, Biden mentioned that each missile, I not exactly which missile, maybe the Javelin missile needs 200 of these chips per missile. So that's a lot of chips. But it seems like it's important that, these chips aren't for producing per se computers or trucks like for the consumer market. It seems like this is directly has to do, the CHIPS Act at least has to do with US missile production or arms manufacturing.
Yeah, that's the focus of it. Because a lot of like the lower end chips, although I will say this, yes, the lower end chips that just go in like everything from like washing machines to your car. Washington has basically declared an all-out chip war on China, though. I mean, they reached out to the UK government 2 months ago and said, hey, that Dutch Chinese affiliate that bought that washing machine microwave chip making company or factory, yeah, you need to make sure that deal gets undone. I'm sorry, are you allowed to do that? Like, well, I guess, as you said, there are client states, so that's going to happen. Yeah. And then they reached out to the Dutch who make a lot of these microchips, and they're like, yeah, you need to stop selling chips to China, period. And it's like, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, this is just totally belligerent behavior. We're not at war with China. China hasn't been evading U.S. sanctions. They've been going out of their way not to. And again, it just seems like one side is picking a fight with the other side. And to me, it's not confusing which side it is. So,
well, have you heard the counter argument? No one is talking about going to war with China. So why are you worried about it?
I mean, I read plenty of publications where people talk openly about. So maybe people just need to read different publications.
Maybe they do. Yeah.
I mean, if you go and order any copy of Foreign Affairs in the last 2 years, I guarantee you there will be an article about how dangerous China is and how we need to prepare to fight China and how China is dangerous to U.S. interests and how all sorts of things, whether it's cyber, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's military, whether it's threatening the U.S. liberal rules-based order, which, come on, what a joke.
Yeah.
Come on. I mean, and again, you talk about the view from Beijing. The view from Beijing looks like this. When the U.S. can't get a UN Security Council resolution to do what it wants, it just goes and invades Serbia or Iraq. When it gets ruled a sponsor of terrorism in places like Nicaragua, the U.S. just ignores it and says, we don't even acknowledge that you have any authority over us at all. So it looks like the rules are for Washington to make and for other people to follow, which is exactly right.
And didn't you? So, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no.
Well, didn't you mention too how was it in Serbia that the U.S. The bombing campaign hit a Chinese embassy?
Yeah,
and killed Chinese nationals.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
And there's a decent amount of like internal writing about that they basically don't think that was an accident. They think that was deliberate, which I don't think that was deliberate. I think that the U.S. has always overhyped its ability to, precision bomb. And, if all that we've learned from WikiLeaks about our drone warfare, like we should be aware now, like these are not, precision surgical strikes. We always get our guy and only him. Like, come on, that's a joke.
Yeah, that's a joke. I mean, the folly of comparing a scalpel or some kind of surgical instrument to a gigantic bomb. It's ridiculous. Like,
right?
How do we even fall for that?
But again, that's why the language. Yeah, that's why the language matters. That's why the language matters. It's just, I know this is jumping the topic a little bit, but like the difference in how the Fed and financial people talk about consumer price inflation versus how they talk about the rise in asset prices, right? That's not inflation. That's a boom. right?
Right.
There's a boom in assets. No, that's called asset price inflation. And you can go look behind the doors at what the Fed's doing, and you'll see exactly what's going on there. But that's why language matters. That's why the language matters.
Yeah. Jeff Dice. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, Jeff Dice just had a piece about this. Speaking of, you were published at the Mises Institute, and I always I appreciate Jeff Dice. I don't know. He has these essays and speeches that he gives that I always feel are directly on point. But there's this thing called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. I don't know if you've heard of it, but
yeah,
and it's been a while since I've talked about it. But isn't it that there are certain human emotions and conceptions that are unique to words? So that, like, the Eskimos have like 30 different words for snow, and each one connotes a meaning that is unique to that language, that something you could only understand if you were an Eskimo. Forgive me if that's not the proper term to use for the people who use this language, but and so to me, that just says that if you can control the meaning of words, you control the unique thoughts that people have itself. So it's mind control. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And the goal of Newspeak in 1984 was to make certain thoughts unthinkable, right? And so we can give all sorts of examples of that today, things that are just totally out of bounds, but they can't quite make the thoughts unthinkable. We're an incredibly free society, and I would never want to live anywhere other than the United States. Yeah. And I'm very thankful for the fact that we are such an open society, that it isn't a mystery. And that's one of the things that's very aggravating about the American population, is that this stuff isn't a secret. Our government has to publish pretty much everything it does. I mean, yes, there are secrets, there are confidential security clearances that we aren't going to get to see for many years. But there's very little that we haven't done in the post-war period that you can't read directly about. There's very little that happens right now that you can't just read for yourself. Again, I'll use the Federal Reserve as an example. The Federal Reserve has its own highly technical language for talking about things. So they'll literally just say it right out loud what they're going to do. And it amounts to bailing out a bunch of hedge funds that made bad bets on treasury spreads. But they say it in such a technocratic, jargon-filled language that no one has any idea what they're talking about. But well, that's the Fed. I mean, they're looking out for the money, so obviously we should do that. Again, it's a matter of using language to obscure the truth about what you're doing. And I don't think this is helpful at all. I think it's really led to a deterioration of faith by Americans in their institutions. I mean, finding out that Colin Powell and the Bush administration had just lied us into Iraq. Like, I came from a straight neocon family who became Tea Parties and Trumpers after that. And then we're just furious with Trump for, not doing what he said he was going to do. I mean, that was really just shocking. And I mean, I came from a family of like real Cold Warriors, like Korea, Vietnam, like real Cold Warriors. And you trust the government. The government is looking out for you, and then they find out, that, and then, the whole subprime crisis and everything that was going on there. I mean, we have a real crisis of confidence, but it's a confidence of the people in their government and in their institutions that are supposedly, hollowed and all this other crap, but they don't work well. They don't work well at all. And when you look at who our leaders are, I think it was Doug Bandow was talking about this the other day, like, it's so embarrassing to meet people from other countries and they're like, you guys, you're the best. Donald Trump was your president. Joe Biden's your president. And it's embarrassing. It's very embarrassing that, like, wow, 330 million people, and this is the best we can do, huh?
Right.
Really? You listen to someone like Xi talk, and, it's just shocking how competent he is on all the policy issues. And I can't imagine Joe Biden, even 30 years ago, giving a speech halfway as coherent. Certainly not Donald Trump.
Yeah, but no kidding.
Yeah, it's really shocking, and I worry because we're one of the only countries in the entire world that could literally just shut off globalization and be pretty much fine. We could be energy independent, food independent. The Mexicans and Canadians, they're rock solid. They got tons of labor, nice markets, lots of natural resources. We'd be fine. We would be totally fine. We got these huge moats separating us from all the conflict zones. We would be fine. But I worry about potential for fragmentation within the United States, just from people, resisting attempts by the federal government to exert more and more control when it's very obvious that they're doing just a garbage job. It's not like they're doing a good job and they're like, hey, just give us some more money and power. We're doing such a great job. You're doing a terrible job and you want more authority and more money and you're telling us that's going to fix the problem. Not at all. Not at all. So just like I think the thing that would save China is to federalize power, to give more power to like the Sichuanese, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans. But you can't do that in China because you have an authoritarian political system. And the CCP's number one priority is maintaining its monopoly on power. The United States, you don't have that. You could literally just decentralize. It'll still be the same Republicans and Democrats dominating. You just have more local autonomy. And that's how you make people rich, is using local knowledge, understanding local incentive structures, and letting people make their own decisions. So, I don't know. It's definitely a scary time to be paying attention.
Yeah.
A lot of sleepless nights, but yeah. Certainly when it comes to China, it's needless stuff. The Chinese are, cranking out materials, making them cheap. I mean, it's definitely boosted the American standard of living at a time when wages are stagnant. And even China now is discovering that, playing the low wage game is not something that only we can do. They're losing tons of manufacturing to places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. I mean, so they're realizing too, they're probably going to get stuck in the middle income trap. That's what the Made in China 2025 is all about, is trying to escape that middle income trap. But just demographically, I think they're in huge trouble. I know we didn't get a chance to talk much about that, but you had the civil war that went on in China. Well, first you had the war against Japan. Then you had the civil war between the CCP and Kuomintang. Then you had tons of just horrible dislocation and horrible policies by Mao, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, that just kept China poor and impoverished. Then you started the two-child policy. Then it became the one-child policy, which that Xi only just got rid of that a few years ago. And one of the things that it led to was selective sex abortion. So you have far more men than women. That's a problem, because if you got a bunch of guys who don't have girlfriends and wives and they don't have a job, they might go for long walks and start talking about things, and that's not good. So that's the hawks. I say that in the article. I think that's the hawks' best argument that like China could be dangerous, is because when the economic crisis eventually comes, and it's been a slow rolling crisis. I don't want to go into like all their property market problems and stuff, 'cause it's kind of opaque and technical and kind of boring, frankly. But if you do have a huge financial crisis in China and a bunch of people are out of work, their best bet could be to throw all these pissed off young guys into a meat grinder over India or Taiwan. So that is possible. But even the CCP's own projections now, which they've kept revising the number down, basically by 2050 now, there's going to be like half the amount of Chinese that there are now. Their demographics are that screwed. So the idea that they're going to be this consumer market that no one can resist, no, that's short-sighted thinking there. India's population is going to eclipse China's by the end of this decade. And it's going to continue moving in that direction. Actually, if the United States can keep its birth rate up, which we're at like 1.7 kids per, if we could just boost that up, maybe with some immigration, I really think we should be trying to get all the young people we can while they're there for the getting, because the world is going to get old fast. And you do not want to wind up like Germany or Japan or how China is going to be. So
you had an interesting statistic about, was it 4 pensioners for every 2?
Yeah.
What? Correct my statistic there. Do you
it's going to be 4 pensioners for every 2 working age people for every 1 child.
Yeah.
So in 30 years, especially with advances in modern medicine and people living longer, you could wind up with like 1 worker supporting like 5.5 or 6 retirees, which like you don't have to be a mathematical genius to know that ain't gonna work.
Yeah.
Especially when China has no fiscal or monetary space to do anything about it. I mean, their debt to GDP is, 2.5 or almost 3 times what ours is. They've got like $7 trillion worth of bad loans hidden away in a very murky financial system that's all intertwined with like state-owned enterprises and banks. And I mean, it's a huge mess. It's a huge mess. And yeah, it's not going to be cool when it collapses. Only bad things are going to happen, not just in China. So it's all going to be bad. And I think it will be less bad if the United States is not seen as having been pushing China to fall. Not saying we should extend a helping hand or anything. I mean, I'm not blind to the fact that the CCP does some things that I frankly don't want them doing.
Right.
The difference is I try and keep it in perspective. Like, we do some things they don't like. It's not the end of the world. We don't need to act like, well, now we need to fight them. We need to fight them now. You know, oh, you don't like them? What are you, a communist? I mean, it's really like a new McCarthyism rolling around. People need to get educated about the old McCarthy scare, because it's really coming back in force. So
when I was reading somewhere to your point about the Hawk's best point, because I was reading somewhere that within the Chinese, their threat assessment of the United States and their strategy for fighting the United States, one of their biggest exploits is how casualty adverse we are. And they have, it seems, you know, you're arguing they have the opposite problem, which is grotesque, but yeah.
Yeah, no, democracies can't take casualties.
Right. Yeah.
You know, John McCain, you know, he was like, what do you mean we got to get out of Iraq? We should stay here for 100 years if that's what it takes. You know, the idea that, you know, back in the 50s, you know, it was a different mindset. It was a different time. These were tougher people who were used to like millions of people dying. Like my grandpa grew up in the Depression, went through World War II, went through Korea. Like, the idea that you might have to sacrifice 50,000 American lives in a police action over Taiwan, that just might be what happens. You know what I mean? It's not hardly unusual at all. Today, the thought of a few hundred Americans dying is like, we're going to have some congressional inquiries. I mean, there's going to be heads rolling. No, I mean, and rightly so. Rightly so.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, you see one or two of our guys get killed somewhere in Africa, dinking around. You're like, what in the hell are they doing in Africa? You know, and you go and look, and it's just the same BS. You know, propping up one side, promoting proxy conflicts. You know, whether it's in Ethiopia, Somalia, take your pick.
Yeah.
You know, the Russians want to dive into Kenya, Mali, let them go for it. It's just a huge mess. And of course, we had a great deal to do with making the mess. And so on one hand, you might say, well, don't you have some kind of moral obligation to make it right? We can't. We really can't. You can't make people do what you want them to do. It's just not possible to control the whole world. So, and we just have to let that go. The unipolar moment was the greatest experiment in social engineering ever. It was a campaign to remake the entire world as liberal capitalist democracies, and it failed, and it was always going to fail. And the idea that we should just push harder and try a little bit harder, our friend Max Boot, who I just loathed in the Washington Post, saying, well, we just don't try hard enough. Well, that sure as hell ain't the problem. I can tell you that. That's not the problem. The problem is trying to act like we can turn Afghanistan into Germany. That's the problem. So, again, there's a lot of ego involved. There's a lot of pride. There's a lot of money involved. When really, the American people, they just want to try and take care of their families, have some prosperity, not die in debt up to their eyeballs, you know, while their communities rot away because we spend $1 trillion a year on a military whose only purpose is to get us involved in the absolute silliest and worst kind of conflicts all over the world. No. You know, and which is what's, you talked about the right and how, you know, the new right is just terrible. How about our new left? What a joke, right? The old left is just rolling over in their graves. Like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, they support the F-35 program, NATO expansion. I mean, come on. They're just tools.
Yeah, it's terrible, man.
It is so terrible.
Brings out the worst. Well, I was talking about this other thesis I had, which is this, the foreign policy consensus is that the left gets the world, or the left gets the United States to hate Russia. That's all we heard. Russiagate, Russia. While at the same time, the populist right and Trump gets the world to hate China. When really, I mean, it's just two, I hate to say this, but it's two wings of the same bird. And at some point, these two narratives are going to combine.
Yeah. I mean, I think they have fully combined. You can read articles now. The Cold War never ended.
Oh, geez, yeah.
Yeah, they've decided, screw it. We're not even going to say
it.
Cold War II. We're just going to say the Cold War never ended.
All right.
We took a break.
Yeah.
We took a break to blow up the Middle East for a while, and now we're back, and we're ready to fight
back,
again.
baby.
And I just think we should say no.
Yeah.
I just think we should flat out just say no. Young people especially. Don't be fooled by the whole flag emojis and, if you don't do this, then you're going to be on the wrong side of history stuff. The history goes back longer than you've been alive, and you don't know hardly half of it. And you're being manipulated.
Yeah.
By the people whose policies made the mess we're in now. What, you expect them to turn around and say, well, turns out that, sponsoring coups in people's backyards and going back on our word and, shoving missiles in people's faces really pissed people off, and now we got some serious conflicts going on? No, of course not. Vladimir Putin has to be some crazy person now, and the Chinese have to be bent on taking over the whole world, which, come on, America. I believe in you. I know you're smart. Don't fall for this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good a place as any. I guess, I want to mention, you mentioned that article that you wrote soon after the invasion of Ukraine, talking about, the West making Russia an example to China. Where did that run?
Oh, the Mises Institute.
It did. Okay. I want to link to that because I want to put it in the show notes because
yeah, we'll do.
Was that run at antiwar.com? Because I don't know how I missed that.
I'm not sure. I don't know. Ryan over at the Mises Institute handles all the permissions and things for like reprints and things.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
Well, I'll be sure to send that to you though.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll pop that in the show notes page. Hey, we should have another conversation because like I said, there's so many facets of the China issue, but we touched on a lot of other great stuff too. And I look forward to reading more of your stuff.
Well, great. Thank you. I really look forward to talking again, Patrick. Thank you again for having me.
Of course. Oh, and can you tell people where to follow you?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at Solis_Mullen. You can find me at the Mises Institute, antiwar.com, the Eurasian Review. I have some papers coming out in various journals, the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, the Journal of Libertarian Studies, the Journal of the American Revolution, actually. I have a cool article in there that I really like. Yeah, you can find all my stuff on my website. I put links up and things, jsmwritings.com. If you want to reach out, I do my best to answer all communications that come my way.
All right. Sounds great. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you so much.